Good afternoon. My name is Elaine Meter-Welgus. I'd like to welcome all the people that are here in person here at Webster's Bookstore Cafe. Today is Sunday, June 19th, Juneteenth, 2022, and we're here with a local author that we're celebrating today, y'all. And I'd like to also virtually welcome all of those that are joining us through the internet to see this presentation. For many of you here, I know that y'all is a known entity, both a neighbor, a colleague, a friend, and someone you admire and want to celebrate his incredible achievement of his first novel. But for those of you joining virtually, perhaps you do not know y'all and his many accomplishments. So I'm going to take this piece of paper and spout them. So try not to blush while I read these, okay? Y'all, Agawu-Kakraba is a professor of Spanish and African Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. Born in Ghana, he holds a PhD in Hispanic Studies from Cornell University. He is the author of Postmodernity in Spanish Fiction and Culture, Diasporic Identities with Afro-Hispanic and African Contexts, and African Lusophone and Afro-Hispanic Cultural Dialogue. A chance encounter with a descendant of Francisco Feliz de Sousa, a freed slave from Brazil, who, at the height of the slave trade, to become a slave merchant. This chance encounter with a descendant of this person inspired the Restless Crucible. He lives in Pine Grove Mills with his wife and daughter, along with two miniature schnauzers. My name is Elaine Meter-Welgus. I'm the owner here at Webster's and apparently very unable to read words in front of me. Note to self, bigger font. But I'd like to welcome y'all. I'm going to remove myself from the presentation at the moment. You're going to do a little description of the book, a short reading, and then we're going to have a little dialogue, and we'd love for you to be part of that dialogue as well. So welcome, if you would.
Thank you very much, Elaine, for such a wonderful introduction. First of all, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to come, especially today is Father's Day, and making time to come and listen to this presentation is very meaningful. I also like to thank my family. I want to thank Anne, my wife, who is here. Our daughter, Delali, is out and about, but she'll be coming later. So again, thank you all for coming to this book launch. So the idea of this book, yesterday we did Juneteenth, and I did have a vendor table, and several people came up to me and said, what inspired this novel? And several years ago, I organized a conference at the University of Ghana. And one of the presentations was by a Portuguese woman who talked about Felix de Souza, a real historical figure from Brazil who was an ex-slave and decided to go to Dahomey to become a slave merchant. And coincidences, one of the descendants of this historical figure came from Benin to this conference. So it was incredible to see the reaction between this researcher who is talking about this historical figure and the descendant of this man. So that's where the idea of this novel came from, that how could somebody who experiences the atrocities of slavery could become a slave merchant? And what is the reaction of this descendant of this man to this historical experience? So, of course, I spent several years doing research and thinking about this novel, and hence the Restless Crucible. So that gives you a short sort of synopsis or background to what inspired this novel. Now, what I'd like to do is to read a few excerpts. And those excerpts that I'm going to be reading, I think, are key in terms of trying to identify Pedro de Barbosa, who is the main character in this novel, the circumstances that sort of led him to become a slave merchant. So I'll read a few pages. I'll start from chapter 1, so you get a sense of the whole beginning. So my life changed when an errant wind made me its accomplice. Among my many chores as Senor Felipe de Barbosa's slave, I delivered a large basket full of breakfast and lunch items to Archbishop Eusebio Trillo. The routine included observing the morning mass that the priest celebrated for the faithful at the Catedra Basilica de Salvador in Salvador de Bahia. At the end of the mass, I carried the crate to the cleric's vast living quarters in Igreja Pedro de Clérigos on Teresa de Jesus Plaza. Rosalinda Almeida, the middle-aged woman who cleaned the premises, swapped the basket with the empty one from the preceding day. It was during one such delivery that a forceful gust from the Bay of All Saints lifted the napkin covering the basket. The wind thrust a letter addressed to the Archbishop into the air. As though desiring to play a game, the wind levitated the note when I undertook to rescue the purloined item. The envelope's contents were empty when I recovered it. At the spot where I had left the basket, a purple paper flaunted its bright color in the air. A quick trot, and I plucked the letter with its exquisite penmanship. 3 words caught my eye before I could stash the letter into the envelope. Your son, Agustinho. What the hell? I said to myself, curiosity getting the better part of me. I unfolded the note and read it. That singular decision and the ones I made after set the course of my life forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. A proper introduction is imperative. My name is Pedro de Barbosa. I'm an ex-slave, a con artist, a slave trader, a warmonger, and a lover. This is a memoir about how I became one of the most powerful and wealthy slave merchants in Dahomey until... I'll leave that part for later. Having cultivated no scruples, I'm not interested in pandering to the fragile emotions of those partial to ascribing to higher moral ground. I couldn't give a rat's ass if after reading this first impartial reflection of me, your dull and delicate sensibilities have been so mad that you decide to cease reading this memoir. Should you continue, you should know that my narrative is honest, regardless of what you may have read elsewhere about me. My many enemies wouldn't hesitate to distort with glee my life story. But as you proceed, I pray you suspend, or better still, bookmark the earlier descriptors I used in presenting myself. I was born in 1793 in Fazenda Barbosa, a sugarcane plantation that belonged to Senor Felipe de Barbosa in Santo Amaro de Purificao, a godforsaken village 20 miles north of Salvador de Bahia. Had I been born in Salvador, a city whose streets are replete with slave children, my life story would have been different. So would have been my fortuitous status as a literate slave. 2 things of considerable importance marked Santo Amaro de Partisao: Emporio Baltasar, a medium-sized retail and wholesale goods store run by Antonio Vargas and his wife Paola, and Cabaret Fortuna Fulas, a nightclub that doubled as a bordello. Although in the back country, Santo Amaro de Purificao boasted of numerous brothels and cabarets thanks to the astronomical rise in the price of sugar and the rumors that several plantation owners squandered thousands of rias gambling and fraternizing with whores. Cabaret Fortuna Fulas was a class of its own. It was the only place in these back countries that musicians from Salvador came to play folklore, jote, lundum, waltzes, polkas, and mazurkas. The brothel was the port of call for the numerous plantation owners, foremen, and overseers who descended on the village from the surrounding sugar plantations at the end of their day's work and over the weekends. When the plantation owners' dignified wives visited the cabaret to avail themselves of prevailing musical trends and fashion from the big cities, their husbands pretended they hadn't paid homage to the establishment earlier in the week. They also feigned knowledge of the illustrious workers in the house. One couldn't say the same thing about Jorginho Caragoso and the 10 unmarried supervisors who worked in Fazenda Barbosa. It was common knowledge among the slaves on the Fazenda that the frequency with which the whip came down was commensurate with the length of time the foreman had spent at Cabaret Fortuna Fulas. I didn't have the fortune or misfortune to have my parents confirm or deny that the intensity and regularity of the whip on their black skins lessened because Jorginho Caragaso and his cohort had come back satiated from sprees with the women of easy virtue. My mother, an African slave from Dahomey, whom I never knew and whose name was foreign territory to me, died in childbirth. Senor de Barbosa sold my father to another slave owner when he found out that not only did my parents have an unapproved relationship, but also that my mother was pregnant. Before selling him, Senor de Barbosa tied my father to a tree and flogged him several times a day for 1 week as a deterrent and a warning to the other slaves. Before I could take my first breath and utter my first cry beside a mother whom I couldn't cuddle, I had already become a victim and prisoner to a system that guaranteed my ruination. That disaster took a dramatic turn when Senor de Barbosa announced he would bring me to Salvador as his 2 children's servant. Fazenda Barbosa was an engaño, an extensive sugarcane plantation that included my master's Casa Grande, a large 2-story high structure with blue stucco walls and latticed windows that stood on a hill overlooking the farm. I'll skip here a little bit. How could I forget the unrelenting and pervading smells, the bagasse drying, the smoke rising from the smokestacks as it burned to heat the cane juice, the wafting into the air of distilling alcohol, the smell of the shit left beside the mill by the horses and mules that worked the wooden rollers to press sugarcane, the heat, the flies, the smoke, the sweat, the smell of the slaves who worked around the clock to ensure that the long trays that cooled the sugar crystals and enabled the syrup to drain into the barrels didn't spill. The earth's rich smell, especially after the torrential tropical rain that brought about humidity so dense one could cut through it with a machete. How couldn't I know that these smells, though offensive to the visitor, were the fragrance of a unique universe reserved only for the native born? How couldn't I remember? How couldn't I remember the voices, the foremen and supervisors, all white men who worked under Marcelo Resendes and cursed the slaves, were quick with their long whips, crack, 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 followed by the expletives, the insults, esgravos perspigosos, fucking lazy slaves. How could I forget Alioso and Lorenzo, 2 teenagers who lost their arms below their elbows on the same day when the wooden rollers crushed their hands along with the sugar cane? What about the children, old men and women with bent backs and maimed like Alioso and Lorenzo, who could no longer work on the sugarcane plantation but couldn't be discarded like the bagasse because they still needed to earn their keep? What about them? What about the long hours they spent working on the fazenda gardens and orchards and produce vegetables and fruits including cassava, cashew, yams, capuasa, papaya, pineapple, hawk plum, and plantains? And the chickens, goats, ducks, pigs, milk cows, guinea fowls they raised? And the nights with dogs barking and cows bellowing plaintively? What about the poorly thatched shacks that house legally married couples and their children, many of whom bore little resemblance to their fathers? And the long rectangular buildings that were home to the unwedded slaves? What about the nights when there were singing and celebration of rituals, despite concerted efforts to Catholicize these slaves who still prefer their own ways? Oludumare and Orishas, the lesser gods who served them. These were the memories that I couldn't simply purge from my mind, even if I wanted to. So I'd like to read another section of it, and with that, I'll conclude. So this is the experiences of Pedro de Barbosa. So he gets to El Salvador de Bahia, and remember the reference to the letter that he read. The consequences of reading that letter is what I'm going to read now. Terreiro de Jesus and Tomé de Sousa and Castro de Alves, three plazas not too far from one another in the center of Salvador, bore landmarks no slave ever forgot. In each of them stood whipping posts where they flogged African slaves for various infractions and disciplinary purposes. The whipping of slaves, which took place every fortnight in these three plazas known as Pelourinho, the whipping post, was a spectacle that brought out audiences. It was a fertile ground for Salvador's homeless kids to pick the pockets of both the rich and the poor. Tied to over 40 posts at any of these plazas, the frenzied crowds shouted, "Cochetealos, cochetealos, cochetealos, whip them, whip them, whip them." The slaves writhed in pain as each of the long canes ripped through their bodies and opened flesh, oozing dark red blood. The spectacle was new to me, but Pelourinho was a well-known destination in Salvador. It was a veritable marketplace of violence and pain, a journey's end for those who experience unthinkable horror that would haunt them forever. Pelourinho, that unforgettable agora, remained implanted in the minds of those whose tortured bodies served as diversion for many a Salvadoran. This was the place, Praça Tomé de Souza, where Señor Felipe de Barbosa took me. My guilt? Lying about the ability to read and to write. In short, I lied about my pedantry. Of course, if they had caught me reading anything else besides that damned letter, the punishment for such a violation wouldn't have risen to the level calling for a visit to Pelourinho. The real offense which Felipe de Barbosa failed to articulate was that I knew the letter's contents and was privy to pernicious information. Josefina's panegyric of education and information came full circle. Only in this case, it didn't come to emancipate, but to castigate. It was a splendid Saturday morning when Señor Felipe de Barbosa, along with Andrea and all the servants, arrived at Praça de Sousa. Ostensibly, my whipping was to serve as a warning to them. The bright blue cloudless sky, along with a brilliant sun, left pleasant shadows in its wake and offered the perfect backdrop to a whipping plaza. It rained the previous night, and muck and sludge covered the ground. Shops on Praça de Tomé Sousa, Terreiro de Jesus, Castro de Alves did brisk business. Shares carts brimming with live chickens, pigs, and carcasses of butchered cows lie in the way of Praça de Sé, 300 yards from Praça Tomé de Sousa, our destination. Other merchants carted wares from the lower city. I shuddered at the sheer number of people whose feet thundered Rua de San Francisco and Rua de Tijolo. They shoved and screamed as we gradually made our way through Rua de Misericordia, a misnomer for a street that would have been best described as my Via Dolorosa, my desolate Via Crucis. The smells befuddled my senses. Boiling dengue oil from a karaje stands, freshly caught fish on sale, animal carcasses, squalid bodies colonizing limited space. As we made our way to the center, Andrea put a hand on my shoulder. I looked at her, surprised at her gesture. She had tears in her eyes. She had become human, I thought. I'm so sorry. You don't deserve this, she said. I didn't respond. I wasn't in the mood to help my tormentor atone for her lapses committed by omission or design. The growing fear tearing at my insides didn't allow me to be charitable, let alone to play the role of an expiator. How could one expect armistice when only one warring party declares hostilities? Salvador's civil police were in full force to control people who whetted their appetites and feasted their eyes on a public flogging that offered them the illusion of settling scores that may have had nothing to do with their Pharisaic sensibilities. Paulo Alvarez de Andrade, the police chief, approached us as we got closer to the post. Senor Felipe de Barbosa took him aside and shared a few words with him. I wondered if it was part of the scheme to make me one of the day's major events for the crowd's entertainment. I doubted it. Led to a pose like a dejected Christ ready to shout, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? I heard a familiar voice. It was Trunk. I'm sorry, Pedro de Barbosa. We are all very sorry, he said. Sorry for what? I wondered. It occurred to me that Trunk may have thought that they had caught me bringing them their daily bread and were being punished. How could he have known of my foolproof methods, which have sustained our daily routine and arrangement? Bounded by a mob seeking unqualified vengeance for no infraction brought about them, Trunk's voice served as a balm, a metaphorical Veronica wiping my face and soothing me on the way to my Calvary of Pelourinho. Thank you.
I'm going to join you on stage now. Maybe. There we go. Thank you so much. It is always such a pleasure to hear the author read their own work. So I know you all appreciate that as well. We're just going to talk for a few minutes because I believe this is an audience that is going to be full of questions, and I'm anxious to hear them. And what we'll do in that process is I'll have you say it, but for the sake of those watching virtually, I'll probably repeat your question as well as I can. Looking at some of those faces, I may not be able to keep up with your questions. We'll see. So you meet this descendant of this ex-slave who becomes a merchant of people.
Mm-hmm.
So was that letter part of the story that you had heard?
You mean
the found letter at the beginning of the story?
No, that is my own construction.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in weighing all of these parts of putting this story together, you yourself, obviously write nonfiction, probably on a daily basis. So moving into the novel, talk about that research and when do you put on the hat of the historian and when do you put on the hat of holding these characters in your hands?
Elena, I think that's an excellent question. I made a decision several years ago that I was going to really transition from writing academic books and papers and explore, the literary tradition. I thought that I had made enough contribution to my field, contemporary Spanish fiction, and that it was necessary to make another contribution, if you wish, to Ghanaian and for that matter, African literature. And so the transition wasn't as difficult because, I've read a lot of Spanish novels, Latin American novels, African novels. So I'm familiar with reading and writing, but the process is not that different. And there's a story that I think I might want to share here. I was in Spain several years ago, and I was interviewing a well-known writer, and I said, where do you get the ideas to write? And I said, if you were to ask me to write anything, I wouldn't be able to write anything creative. And he looked at me and then he laughed and he said, Benito, I had a nickname for me. He said, but you are a writer. I said, no, I'm not a writer. He said, but you write about other writers. It is creative. You have to think about what they've written and be able to analyze that. So I think I walked away thinking that, well, maybe I'm a writer, but not a creative writer, but I have that possibility. And so that is where the transition came in.
Yeah, well, that's a gift that he gave to you, like putting that
Yes.
idea into your head.
Certainly.
Because, even I said, oh, that's different. They're different.
Yeah.
But you're right. When you research, you are doing the analysis, doing the, that little reference to, the children who did not look like their, parentage. We know
Yes.
what you're saying there in that
Mhm.
short phrase.
Mhm.
And, that's the beauty of good writing.
Yeah, I
So-
hope so.
Well, that's the other thing I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you about,
Mhm.
that sort of idea of putting yourself out there.
Yeah.
And, when you're dealing with facts,
Mhm,
right? I know
mhm.
this fact, here it is, and I'm going to tell you.
Yeah.
Now, you take a character that
Mhm.
you have essence filled in the unknown parts.
Yes.
That's a responsibility which you've taken on beautifully, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you.
You
Thank you.
Be proud of
Yeah.
yourself for that. But, this agency that you're giving not just to Pedro, but to
Mhm.
all of your characters,
Yes.
the queen,
Hmm.
that is, talk about how you brought these characters to life.
Yeah, I think for me, what was important were two things. One, to begin to explore why somebody like Pedro de Barbosa would engage in what he did. But I think another part of it that was really important for me was to tell the story of the women who resisted slavery in Africa, in West Africa, particularly in the 18th and 19th century. We don't hear about them. The history books don't talk about them. But yet we know that there was resistance. And so creating Queen Enasunu, is a way to give voice. Because if you look at what she says eventually at the end of the novel, and that is the quotation that I have out there. She says, when they write the history of this slave trade, that the historians will not really elide our presence. They will understand that even though they took away our sons and husbands and children, that we did resist. So in a way, it's to celebrate these women who, unfortunately, we don't get to hear about in the history books.
Yeah. And that is a powerful thing to give
Mhm.
voice, but also to use literature to illuminate through historical
Yeah.
efforts, to shine a light on current situations.
Yes.
And, as the readers here with us today and those joining us through the magic of the internet, what do you hope someone who reads this, it takes away? Obviously, not everyone will take away the same thing. But
Mhm.
what are some of your hopes that you might instill in a reader?
I think two things. One, for them to be aware of this other history, and especially the history of the slave trade from the Portuguese angle. Because when we talk about the slave trade, we think about slaves coming to the United States and maybe the Caribbean, but nobody really talks about the slavery that went on between Portugal, Brazil, and West Africa.
Mhm.
And in my classes, when I tell my students that there were more slaves that were taken to the Caribbean and to Portugal than they came to the United States, they are completely surprised. So that is one thing that I wanted to accomplish. The second thing too that I think is important for readers to think about is that the question of subjugation, the question of making difficult decisions is a perennial issue. I mean, it's not limited to the 18th, 19th century. We still have here, people who have power, people who have wealth, subjugating others. We still have it in this present day. So that is what I hope people will take away from that. Yes, this is a historical novel. It took place 18th, 19th century, but the elements of human subjugation and abuse and lack of representation, they are all still palpable in the days we live in now.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Yeah. Well, let's open up to questions from the audience. Yes.
I was one of the reviewers. Okay. And when I read the book, the manuscript, to read it blurb, when I got to the end, I realized that the narrator's voice, the narrator had changed from the third person to the first person. I struggle with that. And so I asked a few scholars, literary scholars, my friends, and they said maybe he's experimenting. That would be very interesting. And one of the guys I asked is actually an author of literary criticism.
Mm-hmm.
He has book chapters on everybody. So I'm looking at him as somebody who can look at your book and see whether he can excel. He's an African writer, Nigerian. So I discussed the book with him, and I'm like, at this turn, he changes the narrative from the third person narrator to the first person. And as a reviewer, I struggled with it. Okay. So I wanted him, and he says, maybe he's experimenting. I would like to look at it and give him a shot. Maybe he can do a book. He does book chapters on people, including myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to know why you changed. I want to know if you changed accidentally, if you knew you were doing it, and why you thought it was safe to do it as an author.
Patricia, thanks so much. And I'd like to acknowledge publicly Patricia and Rosalind and John, three of my dear friends who read various portions of this novel and did write reviews on them. So the question is why? The first part, of course, was the first person is Pedro de Barbosa writing his memoir. So when I got to the second part, I was faced with a technical issue. How could Pedro de Barbosa understand what was going through the minds of the queen and the kingdom of Dahomey? He doesn't have the knowledge, the experience to do that. And so from a technical point of view, to have him narrate the experiences of these characters wasn't going to work. So yes, was that experimenting? Yes and no. We do have writers already, and in the text I do cite Miguel de Unamuno. And in one of his well-known novels called Niebla, The Mist, one of his characters, Augusto Perez, attacks him because Unamuno was planning to kill him. So I got that inspiration from that. So in order to make the transition between the first part and the second part, I intentionally said forewarning to the reader, because I was going to change the narrative voice. And I do explain why. And I said, Pedro de Barbosa had claimed that he was a con artist, he's a liar and all that, but he omitted certain experiences from his narrative. And so I, as the narrator, would rectify that. And the only way I can do that is to take away his voice, and then I, the narrator, third person, narrate the novel. So that was the technical bridge that I had to cross. And in order not to surprise my readers, I do tell them that it is very much Pedro de Barbosa's story, except that I, the narrator, I'm taking that privilege away from him because he has not been as truthful as he said he would be. So I think that is why I did that.
So what you're saying is you told a man to sit down and shut up and let the woman tell his
Oh,
story. That's very good.
yes, absolutely.
Yes, good.
Yeah.
Yes. That's an excellent question, Patricia. For those of you watching, the discussion was about changing the voice of the narrator. So thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else want to ask a question of y'all?
Yes.
Along those lines. How did you think about locating the narrator in time and space? Where was, because we had this struggle about points at which I argued that if you were really in an 18th or 19th century phase, you would not only not have the language of a certain kind of critique, but you would not even have the consciousness. So that comes to this line between history and fiction,
Yeah.
authority, and even in history, there's a struggle
Yeah.
about what kinds of documents you can use. Is it appropriate to use, for example, film as a way of commenting on the past, because you know that narration is coming from an extraneous historical perspective.
Certainly.
So I wonder how you located yourself. Could you start with you're in the contemporary?
Yes.
Barbosa.
Mm-hmm.
Then what happens?
That is an interesting and difficult question to answer. I think you make a good point by underscoring the fact that even with history, if you were to use, say, a film to represent it, you have some technical challenges, certain differences, difficulties, and for me, I think what I did was to use my creative license as a writer to bend the rules, if you wish, to provide a space where there is enough flexibility to be able to move between both the contemporary and the world of the 18th century, 19th century. I think my only response to that is that, well, I'm the author, so I can write whatever I want, so long as I'm true to the intent of the novel and true to the historical elements involved. Yeah. Yes, Mary.
I think that's the freedom of fiction, isn't it, over history? I mean, it's not that you don't do your research, you've done a massive research, but what you can do is then jump off it and tell a story.
Yeah.
And it's lovely, because when you're a historian, you've got to document everything, but now you're free.
Yeah.
And you can make up a better story. It's the lie that tells the truth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's the illumination of literature, sort of, shining that light on our current society.
Absolutely.
And Joan brings up a great point. Absolutely. I mean, how would this man have this sort of, just wonderful understanding of what his place in history had been?
Mm-hmm.
But that is what you do through novelization, but also asking the reader to sort of sit with it, not as a piece of documentation of history, but a piece of sort of analysis of what would you do?
Absolutely.
Or how would you do that, even if you would never find yourself in that situation?
Yes.
And again, you taking on the role of taking these characters and, the agency of, the voices that you give to the, the queen and the resistors. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, kudos for using, literature to, again, shine that light. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I would say something. I was fascinated by the book because I'm familiar with the other story. And I'm also African, so I'm familiar with the story of colonialism. And many Africans don't blame the Portuguese as much as some of us who know blame them. Portugal was the last country that ever gave independence to any African country.
Yes.
And so we still hold them. So that story is fascinating. But as much as I love the story, and I endorse it, as a creative writer, the safest place for the writer is the third person. That's the safest place. So if you find out at the end you need to switch, just go safely back to the third person. Because with the third person, you don't have to worry about the language of the character. You don't have to worry about everything. You are omniscient. You are omniscient, omnipotent. And I would have loved that to continue through the book. Because then you don't have to explain to anybody, because you don't have, in literature, in history, you have the audacity to explain to your readers what you are doing. But in fiction, in writing a novel, you cannot do like the old time writers did in the 1700s, where they decided to tell you what was going to happen. In today's fiction, you don't have the liberty. And I'm preparing you, because if this book makes it to the African literary critics or to any literary critics, you will have a lot of questions to answer. And you should be ready, because they will ask you, why? Why did you do that?
It's when you get to say, because I wanted to.
Exactly. Because I wanted to. This is not history. I mean, I wanted to. But on some level too, I think there's a point in which I, as the author, I insert myself in the novel. I have a conversation with Pedro de Barbosa, at one part, and I'm not going to give away too much, at one part when he realizes that the narrator has taken the narrative voice from him, he gets very, very angry, because he realizes he can no longer write his own memoir. So what does he do? He decides to attack the writer, me, and insults me. And then I keep my cool. And then at the end, he comes back to me, but in this case, I am quiet. And then through his own self-reflection, he begins to understand or question what is the truth. So I think I was playing with different literary traditions here, and I thought many African novels, African writers, perhaps maybe because of my training as a literary critic, that I'm able to perhaps bring another viewpoint in terms of creatively writing and seeking recourse to other writers.
Excellent. Any other questions from the audience? David.
Thank you for inviting us. One question I have is, with your own personal journey as the author, you must have had, I think, as an African and as a man who generationally, even though you're from Africa, generationally has obviously been affected by these historical events. What kind of personal journey did you have to go on to find the voice of somebody who is so different?
Yeah, Dave, I think that's a good question, because one of the things that emerged in the novel is I had to treat the question of Africans engaged in the slave trade, and somehow sometimes it's difficult for Africans back in Africa to talk about their involvement in the slave trade, and unfortunately sometimes there's this tension between Africans in Africa and then African Americans in terms of, well, you sold our people back and forth. But I wanted to give a nuanced approach or response to the fact that there was slavery in Africa, Africans engaged in the slave trade, but we are talking about dimensions. We are talking about what happened there. So in that sense, even though I'm not, it doesn't affect me directly, I am interested in exploring that conversation that oftentimes is difficult to have on the part of Africans. And honestly, sometimes the lack of sensitivity of Africans back, and maybe I'm generalizing, but the lack of sensitivity on the part of some Africans to the plight of our own people in this country, in the Caribbean, in other parts of the world. So, I think from a personal experience or a personal contribution to that dialogue, I thought that it was important to explore all these various dimensions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I come from Spain actually, so to me it sounds very interesting, this comparison here from Amuno. And I was wondering if there will be a Spanish translation of the book. It will be translated into Spanish.
Well, I have some friends in Spain, colleagues in Spain, and I sent them the PDF and others, and I said, could you please read it and write comments about that? And most of them came back and said, well, I don't speak English very well, so can you have it translated? I haven't explored that option yet, although I have colleagues in Brazil who are very, very interested in having it translated. So I think because Salvador is such an important part of this novel, and my colleagues in Salvador de Bahia have mentioned that this would be interesting for the people there. So probably we would want to explore that option first. But certainly we can work together and maybe you can do the translation. Thanks.
Wonderful questions. Anyone else? Anyone else have a question? Richard.
I'm curious about your, okay, the book is written in English. Did you ever find yourself thinking in another language and then translating it into English as a way of like, like there are some times when like thinking in Spanish would allow you to come up with different ideas. Was that ever part of your process?
Good question, Richard. I've always lived in the world of 6 to 7 different languages. I speak 6 fluently, and sometimes it's difficult to sort of partition these languages and navigate between them. I think what I found interesting, especially when I was in Brazil doing research for this, was trying to approach the language and the culture from the experience of a Spanish critic, somebody who speaks the language, and also being cognizant of the fact that Yoruba language is such an important part of the religion and everything in Brazil. So I wouldn't say that I had much of a difficulty in terms of transitioning between languages and writing this in English. I have a colleague who is from Portugal, and she translated certain parts of ideas that I had for me. So I was able to use her goodwill to help me with that. But it's a good question. It didn't really occur to me while I was working on this. Yeah.
Great. All right. I think I'm going to wrap up the internet part here, but we'll continue the discussions here amongst ourselves. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you for those who are joining us through the live stream or watching this after the fact. The book is, if I may borrow your copy,
yes, of course.
The Restless, Crucible. It is published by Mount Nittany Press, which is an imprint here in State College, Pennsylvania, but we do hope that its reach will be worldwide. Ya has been so gracious to to come and do this presentation today and to have this streaming out into the world. The book is available, I believe, on Amazon. You can order it, of course, through our bookstore, Webster's Bookstore Cafe. If you see, I'm sure if they see you on the street, they could buy a copy directly from you. Correct?
Yes, yes, yes.
And it's also available on ifrigpublishing.com, EIFRIG. So congratulations.
Thank you.
I hope that this, I heard you say earlier that this, you've been thinking about moving out of the academic writing. I hope this is just your first of many forays into, exploring literature and becoming an important voice
Thank you.
in the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll end here, but thank you. Pardon me as I cannot make the button go.